Follow your dreams because too often it's the nightmares that come true. You're an absolute gem. Thank you for clicking on my Suspect series. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today we're going to be talking about the Villisca Ax Murders. Now this involves horrific deaths, a ruined crime scene, and fingers pointed at multiple people, but it's still unsolved. By the way, I post so much content like this, so please, I would love your support by subscribing and thumbsing up. Now let's get back to this story. So it was 1912 in the quiet town of Villisca in southwestern Iowa, and here lived the Moore family. Now the parents were Josiah B., who had grown up on a farm and who had 13 siblings. His future wife Sarah also grew up on a farm and had one sibling. They married in 1899 and ended up having 4 children. Henry Montgomery was the oldest at 11, then Mary Catherine, who was 10, then 7-year-old Arthur Boyd, and then 5-year-old Paul Vernon. They did pretty well for themselves with their farm equipment sales business. Everybody in the town knew them and liked them. They never really had a problem with anybody, and in fact the parents of the town would trust their kids to go over at any time and would have no problem with it at all. And that's what happened on June 9th of 1912. The Stillinger sisters, Ina May and Lena Gertrude, who were 8 and 12, actually stayed over at the Moore house. It was a Sunday, so the family and the sisters actually went to a Children's Day service at the Presbyterian Church, and the Moore mother, Sarah, was actually the co-director of the whole thing. The children performed speeches, and then the parents afterwards talked for a little while, and by the time they were headed to leave, it was about 9:30 p.m. They were walking home, which was only about a 3-block walk, and they were walking towards a nighttime snack, basically of milk and cookies. They got there no problem, had their cookies, and went to bed. Josiah and Sarah actually were upstairs in their bedroom. Their 4 kids were down the hall from them, and then the Stillinger sisters were downstairs in the guest room. When the next morning rolled around, the house was very quiet, almost too quiet, and by 7:30 their neighbor Mary Peckham actually thought that it was very, very strange and almost seemed deserted. By this time the Moore family, or the children, one of them was always outside doing chores by this time, and nobody had come out yet. After a while, their neighbor's paranoia got the best of her, so she walked over to knock on the door. And nobody came to the door, and it was also locked, which was very unusual in this small town, and at this time nobody was really locking doors. So she decided to go over and let their chickens out just to be nice and help them out that morning. Then Mary decided to call Josiah's brother Ross Moore to come and help her see what was wrong. Ross Moore was a local pharmacist who obviously lived in the area, so it didn't take him very long, and he got there at about 8 a.m. He tried knocking and even shouting through the door, and still nobody answered, so that is when he used a key that he had to their house and unlocked the door. Mary stayed on the porch while Ross went inside to look around. He went through the parlor and eventually got to the guest bedroom door, where he opened it and came upon a bloody mess on the bed and 2 figures covered in a sheet. There was also a kerosene lamp that was right below the bed. Under these sheets was Ina and Lena Stillinger. Unable to look any further in the house, Ross backed out and asked Mary to call for help. It's unsure of who actually made the call, but a call was made to Joe's hardware store, and a man named Ed Seeley picked up. He was told that something terrible had happened and to please get the police. Ed immediately went to get Marshal Henry Hank Horton, who was Villisca's peace officer at the time. Hank got to the Moore home at about 8:30 a.m. and he went inside only to come back with far worse news than Ross wanted. He said point blank that someone had been murdered in every bed. Every member of the family, as well as the 2 visitors, were found dead, beaten by a blunt end of an axe about 20 to 30 times. And it turned out that the murder weapon that actually belonged to Josiah was found in the guest bedroom, leaning against the wall where the Stillinger sisters were. It was partially cleaned and had a 2-pound slab of bacon wrapped in a towel right next to it. It had a partial part of a keychain next to it as well, and in the kitchen there was found a plate of uneaten food and a bowl of bloody water. While the police, coroner, minister, and several doctors went around the entire crime scene that was the whole house, the news of what had happened had begun to go around town, and many people came and stayed outside to see if they could see anything going on. Inside the home, however, a timeline was being put together as to when and how this happened. It was thought that from the 2 cigarette butts found in the attic that the killer or killers stayed there and waited for the Moore family to come home and go to bed. It was also thought that possibly from the indents in a hay bale in the barn and a little hole that was in the side of the barn where you could see the house, that the killer or killers started there. Doctors concluded that the murders began from midnight to 5 a.m. and that the parents were struck first, with Josiah actually hit by the blade of the axe rather than the blunt end like everybody else. He was hit so hard that his eyes were missing, but everybody else was just as bad and unrecognizable. They thought that then the killer went to the children's room where he found Herman, Mary, Arthur, and Paul, and beat them to death as well. Then it was found that Herman's face was covered with an undershirt and Mary Catherine's was covered with a dress. And then it appeared from a shoe that had blood filled in it and been spilt over that the killer went back into the parents' room and hit them more times. Both bedrooms showed gouge marks and the ceiling that showed the force of the axe as it came up and went back down. Then it was thought that the killer went downstairs to the guest room where the Stillinger sisters were, and Lena Gertrude was actually awake. They thought this because she was found kind of crosswise on the bed, had a defense wound on her arm, and also had a bloody spot on her knee, almost as if someone had grabbed her with blood on their hand. Her nightgown was also pushed up, and although they feared the worst, that she had been sexually assaulted, she actually hadn't been. There was no signs of that, but if she was awake, she was the most brave 12-year-old girl ever, because they thought that she had possibly woken up and tried to fight back. Then after the murders, it was thought that there was a possible ritual of sorts done. The dresser drawers looked to be like they were searched pieces of clothing, and every mirror and glass was covered in clothing, as well as the children's faces, and cloths and towels were used to cover the windows and the entry door. Then it's thought that the killer went to the kitchen table, tried the food, washed his bloody hands in the bowl, and after he was finished, he went to the fridge to get the slab of bacon and put it in the girl's bedroom for an unknown reason. Then he, she, or they left the house. Now, once the officials were done collecting all of this information, they actually went outside where they warned the citizens of the town not to go inside, saying, "Don't go in there, boys, you'll regret it until the last day of your life." People did anyway, even though there was still splattered blood everywhere. One even took a fragment of Josiah's skull, almost as a keepsake. A very creepy one at that. The funerals were held 2 days after the murders on June 12th. Thousands of people showed up to Villisca's town square. It was a joint funeral between the Stillingers and the Moores, and a parade of 50 carriages long actually took them to the funeral home. Their cases were not on display at the funeral for good reason, and they were buried at the Villisca cemetery. These victims still didn't have a name for their killer, and even though there were leads coming in and the bloodhounds had sniffed the town, there were searches done, nothing was being found that was useful. The crime scene was now completely destroyed by people who had gone inside, so they couldn't even go back and look at it. First, a man named Frank Jones was looked into. He was a local businessman and Iowa state senator. Josiah had worked for him for 7 years before eventually quitting and starting his own business, which was a competition against Frank's. Everyone in town could attest to the deep hatred that Josiah and Frank had for one another, but nobody could say whether it was strong enough to murder the entire Moore family. Now, rumors were flying that Josiah had actually been having an affair with Frank's daughter-in-law at the time, but nobody can confirm that either. It wasn't enough information to arrest Frank in the Moore's murders. Josiah's brother-in-law, Sam Moyer, was also questioned because he had also said that he had a strong hatred and would kill Josiah, but he had an alibi that completely cleared him. Henry Lee Moore was also a suspect, and he had no relation to the Moores that were murdered, but he had killed his mother and his grandmother a few months after the Moore murders using an axe, but no strong connection was made. Some believed that Senator Frank Jones actually hired a man named Williams Blackie Mansfield because 2 years after the Moore murders, he killed his baby, his wife, and his parents-in-law, and he used an axe to do it. It's also thought that he was responsible for the Axe Murders that happened in Paola, Kansas 2 days before the Moore murders. But he was released after the grand jury of Montgomery County refused to indict him because of an alibi that supposedly checked out. But Detective James Wilkerson believed that Mansfield was a cocaine-addicted serial killer who had killed many, many people. These murders that were happening had the same MO, and all of the mirrors were covered. But when Mansfield was arrested again, payroll records cleared him with another alibi. He even won a lawsuit against them that won him $2,225. Detective Wilkerson believed that Senator Frank Jones had something to do with his release. There was even a witness that was a restaurant store owner that saw Mansfield coming from Villisca the morning of the murders, which would completely prove his alibi untrue. Then the most likely suspect was found. He was Reverend Lynn George Jacqueline Kelly, and he had a history of mental problems and mental breakdowns and peeping on young girls. He had been assigned to be a visiting minister in several small communities, and on June 8th he arrived in Villisca to teach the Children's Day services that the Moore family attended June 9th. The next day, before the bodies were found, he took a train out of Villisca at 5:19 in the morning. A few weeks later, he returned to town posing as a detective so he could take the tour with the other investigators of the Moore house. He also began writing letters not only to police but to the living relatives of the Moores, saying that he had heard noises that day and that he had possibly witnessed something. He was only 5'2" and 119 pounds, but he was left-handed like the blood spatter indicated the killer was. And also a nearby town of Macedonia also said that Kelly had brought bloody clothes in to be cleaned. An elderly couple came forward saying that they met him on a train that morning, but nothing else was connecting him. Until 2 years later, when he was arrested for sexually harassing a woman who was trying to be his secretary. He was sent to a national mental hospital in Washington, D.C. and held. That was when it was speculated again that possibly he did kill the Moores. And 3 years later, he was arrested for their murders. And on August 31st at 7 a.m., he signed a confession saying that God whispered to him, "Suffer the children to come unto me," and that he'd killed the children upstairs first and downstairs last. And then he heard a voice saying, "Slay utterly," and he went on because he was in the grip of something he did not understand. But he recanted the confession at trial, and so did the elderly couple who had said that they'd seen him on the train. And he went to trial twice before being acquitted. During these trials, another man's name came up, and he was Andrew Sawyer. Thomas Dyer, who was a bridge foreman for the Burlington Railroad, came forward saying that Andrew walked up to him and his crew that morning at around 6 a.m. He was clean-shaven, he was wearing a brown suit, but his shoes were all muddy and his pants were wet up to the knees. He asked for a job, and Thomas gave him one because they were low on staff. But upon being with him for a while, they noticed some very strange behavior. He once actually bought a newspaper with the Villisca murders on the front and kind of took it into the other room to read it. He also slept with his clothes on and an axe right next to him. He often talked about the Villisca murderer and if he'd been caught, and even said that he was actually in town the night of the murders and was afraid he was going to be considered a suspect. One time he actually walked up behind him where Andrew didn't know he was behind him, and he heard Andrew saying, "I will cut your goddamn heads off." And then he took his axe and was like hitting the piles of paper in front of him. But he wasn't talking to anybody. Andrew also told Thomas's son, J.R., that he would show him where the man who murdered the Moores got out of town. In detail, he said that the man jumped over a manure box, went across the railroad tracks, and used an old tree branch to go across the stream. And everything Andrew said was there was. So on June 18th, Thomas turned him in. But he also had an alibi. He was arrested in a nearby town for vagrancy, and the officer there said that he put him on a train at around 11 that night. So he was also dismissed. A woman came forward saying that she had heard plotting by 3 men in the woods that they were going to kill the Moore family, but nothing ever came of that either. Although there was plenty of suspects, this case has never been solved. The house has not really been touched that much since the murders happened. In fact, there are tours that you can go in to look around, and it's what a lot of paranormal investigators do. There seems to be some sort of presence within the house. It's not sure if it's the Moors who were murdered or what, but it's almost said to be one of the haunted places in America. And the stories about what happened with the people who go there to experience the paranormal things are crazy, and I will 100% do a part 2 to this, going over the paranormal aspects of the Moore Axe Murder House, if you guys would like. But there is a movie on Netflix called The Axe Murders of Villisca, and it's loosely based on what happened, and it's more about the paranormal aspect. If you like paranormal type movies, it's a really good movie, actually. I was surprised. And it also is kind of around YouTube vloggers as well, and there's a little sneak peek of Joey Graceffa in there if you like him. That was just a nice surprise. But what drives me crazy the most is that an entire family could be murdered in such a small town and nothing was found. How is that possible? How did nobody hear anything, especially when the neighbor was so worried about them that morning because she knew what it was supposed to sound like? You know, were they all just asleep when it happened, or did any of them scream? It's so frustrating, and I really hope that someday, somehow, somebody comes forward, confesses, or there's a huge break in this case. Let me know what you think down below, if any of the suspects sounded more likely to you, or if you have another theory. I'd love to hear it, and make sure to thumbs up to give me some support so I don't feel as crazy, because this is a very dark case, and so I'm trying to like get myself out of like the weird dark rut that you can get in when researching these cases. So yes, don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye. To be good or bad, you have a choice. All it takes is using your voice.